So hello and welcome to Module 1 of the Masayana workshop. I'm Karen Santillan, and with me today is architect Nico Manalo.
Hi, Karen. How are you?
I'm good, and you?
I'm okay. I'm trying to give a
And who's
talk.
behind you?
Um, it's
Who's
our
your
office.
friend?
It's our office pet.
Okay. He
Yeah.
looks kind of disemboweled, but sige. So, architect Nico, what are you going to talk about today?
Well, I'm gonna talk about what everybody's been talking about. It's modern Philippine architecture, but it's something that maybe not a lot of people have thought about.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even you haven't thought about it so much sometimes because we just talk, right? But we don't think why we're talking about something,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to delve on that
Mm-hmm.
for this lecture. Why we talk about modern Philippine architecture. So what is the significance, right, of modern Philippine architecture? Well, I'll try to explain that to you guys.
All right.
Thanks, Karen, for the short introduction. And I'm here to talk to you about modern Philippine architecture and the significance in modern Philippine architecture. And as I said earlier, we've been talking about this, but why are we actually talking about it? So let's start with the abstract. When Karen asked me to talk about significance, immediately I thought of the Heritage Law of 2009 because this is very important, especially to us in the Philippines, because this is what protects our cultural property, so including our buildings. And it says that buildings that are at least 50 years of age or works of national artists are already protected. But it also says that they can be taken out, right? That importance can be taken out because it is only presumed to be important. So I think what we have to do is to make sure that we justify the protection. So in justifying the protection, we need to tell people why it is important, why it is significant. So let's move to the next slide, significance. The Oxford Languages Dictionary says that it is the quality of being worthy of attention or importance. That's what we were saying earlier. In the second part, it says the meaning to be found in words or events. So the first one just says quality of being worthy of attention. That's actually what we were talking about earlier, right? We discuss it. We go into dialogues about modern Philippine architecture. So it does get our attention, but the quality, we have to know what it exactly is, why we talk about it, why it's important, why we need to protect it, right? I'd like to also stress, for example, this second word, importance, right? In Tagalog, it's kahalagahan, and halaga, right, comes from the root word halaga. It means value in English. So we have to put value into those buildings that we're looking at. And to be able to put value, we need to know what kind of values are normally ascribed to buildings, no? Or even to other cultural properties. And then in the second, it's highlighted there, meaning, right? Everything has meaning. So all of these buildings also have meaning. So what is that meaning? It's what that building or this site or this place is trying to convey to its audience, right? So it's sort of like the message that it wants to tell you. The Burra Charter of Australia, ICOMOS, defines cultural significance as aesthetic, historic, scientific, social, or spiritual value. So you see that word already, value, for past, present, or future generations. I think this is very important because it says past, present, and future generations, meaning to say that value and significance may change, right? So what is important or what is significant to a past generation may be more significant to our present generation. And then they might ascribe a different significance in the future, right? So it may change, right? But also in the second bullet, it says that it is embodied in the place itself. So it's there, right? In the place itself, it's fabric. Fabric means materials. And then its setting, it's not just the building, but also everything around it. We know what use is. Associations, it could be part of a series of buildings. Like, for example, what you see in the left side of your screen is the National Nutrition Council building of Leandro Locsin. And it also is related to other works by Leandro Locsin. So it has associations, right? Meanings, records, related places, and related objects. So, is modern significant? And can we consider it part of our cultural heritage? I'm asking this because a lot of people would think, if it is modern, it's new, right? But cultural heritage is normally old. Of course not. It's not. That's not the thing. If something is continuing, right? If it continues up to our present day, then it is as fresh as how it was when it was first conceived. But first off, what is modern? I'm putting forth this phrase. So this comes from a document from the Spanish period, but the translation says that the most modernly constructed building. And what is it describing as the most modernly constructed building? It's this one. So I'm sure you're all scratching your heads that that's not modern at all, right? That's not the most modernly constructed building. But for the year 1847, it might be the most modernly constructed building. So it comes from an album of vistas, of views of the Philippine Islands and of costumes of its inhabitants. So included in the album is this view of Manila. You see it. It looks slightly medieval, but the city actually had a very Baroque feel at that time, right? And this is a fantastic reference, right? Because sadly, a lot of buildings in Manila were destroyed in the Second World War and continue to be destroyed even to this very day. So you have here a view of the main plaza, the Plaza Mayor of Manila, and you can see two buildings marked A and B. To the left is the Casas Consistoriales, more commonly known today as the Ayuntamiento. And then dead center is building B, that's the cathedral. They look very different from the buildings that you see presently in Intramuros, because these are the Baroque versions of these buildings. So Manila back then was sort of like a thoroughly Baroque ensemble of buildings and structures, right? And even if you look at this view, for example, it says Casa de la Intendencia. So this is a government office, but the government office still looks like it's a house. So a lot of our buildings before took on that same construction technology that they used for building houses, for building bahay na bato. So you see government buildings like the Intendencia sharing the same language as all of the other houses that you see in these two streets. It's Baroque because all of these structures participate in the drama that unfolds in the streets, right? You don't see any gardens behind them. It's one big theater. But the thing here is, at that time, some of the travelers that come into Manila would say that it's quite monotonous. So it's exactly what you're seeing. Everything sort of looks the same, right? And then this building again comes along. This building is so new, it's so modern when it was built. And why is that? Look at it. It's not Baroque. It is neoclassical in style. And if you really think about it, there is hardly any competition around it. You can see it from all four sides, right? You can view it, you can go around it. It's really one of those monumental buildings that was singular in the city back then, right? So that's why they thought it was modern. Again, the year you see here, it's highlighted. It's 1847, and I put that because it's important to equate this concept with time, right? So if we think about time, and for example, if we associate time with clothing, then you know that time is also equated with fashion, right? So if you think of time within the context of architecture, you're thinking of style, right? So there are different styles in different periods in time. So I said two words, time and period. So here underneath you have a chronology of architecture. We won't go into the specifics of this chronology, but I'd just like to show you how it is divided into periods, and each period may have one or various styles within it, right? So period being a length of time, and it is belonging to or characteristic of a past historical time. So it has already happened, right? So we know that shifts in style could affect the different kinds of significance. So you have architectural significance, historical significance, scientific and social significance, like earlier when it was defined in the Bura Charter. So first up, we'll look at architectural significance. And I don't want to read this to you because you can see it in your screens, but I've highlighted one word. It's demonstrating. So it has to have that ability to demonstrate, right? So if you're talking about, like, for example, characteristics of architectural planning, design, style, decorative detailing, or construction technique, then this building has to be able to demonstrate all of that. So I move on to the next slide, and I'm showing you Section 5 of Republic Act 10066, which I briefly discussed earlier. It's the heritage law of the Philippines from 2009. And it says that cultural property considered important cultural property, and you look at letter B, it also says works by a national artist. So in this case, works by a national artist for architecture. And then in letter F, it says structures dating at least 50 years old. So let's look into architectural significance, but for the Philippines as works by national artists. So we have here 6 national artists for architecture and the allied arts. So the first one, 𝗦𝗶𝗶𝗴𝗶, was conferred the National Artist Award in 1972. So he was the first one. And this is him. He was born in 1899 and he passed away in 1986. And 𝗦𝗶𝗶𝗴𝗶 began designing buildings in a very Art Deco style, right? So you see here the Capitol Theater. I know a lot of you are very familiar with the Capitol Theater, and pictured here is the tower-like structure in the horizontal facade. So this is the one that pops out, right, of the entire structure. And you can see how at that time it was so thoroughly modern. The detailing, the Art Deco detailing, even the signages with the lights and everything. It was very, very modern. And at that period, theaters were considered the new temples of the city of Manila, right? So the churches were competing for attention with the theaters in Manila. And then he also designed another theater, the Rizal Theater, which is so different in style. So this is a couple of decades after the Capitol Theater, right? So you see here a different language already, and very prominent is his use of vertical sun baffles. And you're going to see this happening also in the architectures that are going to be featured in the other works by national artists. Sadly, this theater is now demolished. If you want to know where it used to stand, it used to be where Shangri-La Hotel in Makati is, that area. So Shangri-La Abenson landmark. The next one that was declared, the next person declared as National Artist for Architecture is Pablo Antonio. And just the same, Pablo Antonio began his career also during the Art Deco period. And one of his masterpieces is this building, the most prominent building of the Far Eastern University. This is the one, this is the facade facing Quezon Boulevard. But then, just like 𝗦𝗶𝗶𝗴𝗶𝗵 before him, years later, he would design something so different to the Far Eastern University's main building. So this is the Galaxy Theater, which was in the Santa Cruz district, and it also is thoroughly modern. And you can also see the use of those vertical sun baffles right there. And then next, the third one that was declared is Leandro Locsin, one of the more prolific architects that the Philippines had produced. He's most noted for his brutalist architecture within the complex of the Cultural Center of the Philippines, especially this one, the Cultural Center of the Philippines building. So you can see that it has that floating form that he is very much known for, and other characteristics. And the next one is slightly different. It still appears to be floating, but this time he already explores the vernacularization of his brand of architecture. So you see that you can link it already to the Bahay Kubo, or even the domestic structures that are found in the Cordilleras, in the highlands of Luzon. And then next is Jose Maria Zaragoza. He lived between 1912 and 1994, and he also was a big admirer of the modernist styles that had emerged in Latin America, and this can be seen in the Union Church of Manila, which unfortunately also was demolished a couple of decades back, and a different building occupies that site today. But he is most known for his magnum opus, which is the Meralco building. And here you can see how he takes those vertical baffles, those vertical sun baffles, into a different plane, right? It's a totally different scale already. And this is one of the more important corporate headquarters that any corporation had actually built in the metropolis back then. And then one of the last ones that was conferred the National Artist Award is Francisco Mañosa. He's most known for the use of indigenous materials in his architecture, but he is also noted for producing some of the most enigmatic architectures that we have, and this is of course the San Miguel Corporation's headquarters, also in the Ortigas district, like the Meralco building. And you have the national artist for landscape architecture, Ildefonso I.P. Santos Jr. So his idiom, his brand of landscape architecture blends so well with the architecture that was being produced in the 1970s, 1980s. So starting with buildings and complexes in the Makati district. So we also have historical significance. So here it says a place may have historical significance if it is a product or of an example or was influenced by or there are a lot of ors, and then you see an event, phase, movement, process, activity, way of life, right? So whatever it is that that has made an impact on the history of a society, if the architecture contains that, then it may have historical significance. historical significance may vary. Like for somebody, for example, for maybe for me and my family history, it is a house is important because that's where my father grew up. So for me, that holds historical significance. But then for a country, it has to hold historical significance for the entire nation, right? So let's take a look at three buildings here. So this is the 𝗤𝗏𝗶𝗵𝗶 complex, which is in Quezon City, and this is from 1975. And then here we have the Philippine International Convention Center by the National Artist for Architecture, 𝗦𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. And then here we have the gymnasium of LaSalle, the LaSalle campus in Green Hills in San Juan. So what do these three buildings have in common, and why are we talking about these three buildings while we're discussing historical significance? It's because in 1986, after the elections were held, when the counting of the ballots were being done, a lot of these buildings served a purpose either as places where the ballots were being counted, or where all of the counts from the other parts of the country were coming in, or were also, if there was an organization there also involved in the count, right? So in this picture, you have a walkout of the people who were counting the ballots in the Philippine International Convention Center. In the 𝗤𝗏𝗶𝗵𝗶. So this is a photo of that walkout as people were exiting the 𝗤𝗏𝗶𝗵𝗶. And this is the walkout that was happening also in the Philippine International Convention Center, while in the gymnasium of the LaSalle campus, the People's Organization, 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗏, was also conducting its own count, and they were the ones that were reporting irregularities to the general population. So these three buildings are very important in that one historical chapter in the history of the Philippines, which gave birth to the 1986 EDSA revolution. But since we're talking about periods and styles, maybe we can look at it from a historical perspective. Like, for example, after the war, Pablo Ocampo created his own house. And you see that even if it does allude a little bit to traditional architecture before the war, the entire house is actually very, very modern. He even takes elements from the philosophy of Frank Lloyd Wright. But then you also have houses like this one. This was in New Manila in Quezon City, and this was built in the 1950s. The house of Pablo Antonio was built in 1948. So this 1950s house looks back to a period before the war, right? When there was relative peace, there was relative security, and you see that the architecture is very traditional, harking back to a Spanish past, which was also the aesthetic that the Americans used during their colonization of the Philippines. And then in the 1960s, you have these emerging. So this is a thoroughly modern bungalow, also in New Manila in Quezon City. So it doesn't anymore exhibit all of those elements that make it traditionally Filipino. Inside, it looks like it actually would look like an interior from any other house, whether it be in California or in Sydney in Australia. And then in the 1970s, you would have something like this. So from aspirations of the modern and from looking out to what other countries are doing with their architecture, this modern style was already distilled and then given a Filipino touch once again. So this is the house of Mr. and Mrs. Leandro Locsin. in Quezon City. No, sorry, in Makati. So you already see that blending of modern and traditional in their home. But I guess what I'd like for you to look at here is the use of that chandelier, which would be recurring in the next couple of slides. Like, for example, here, Lindy Locsin also worked on a number of historical structures in Manila, especially here in the Manila Hotel. So you see that that he also had imbibed that into his own architecture, blending the traditional with the modern, like he does here in the Cultural Center of the Philippines, where he has these three magnificent chandeliers, albeit in a very modern interpretation of a traditional one, but encased in such a beautiful brutalist building. And then he, like I said before, had been also looking into how traditional Philippine architecture could be reinterpreted using modern materials. This is another view of the building I showed earlier, which is the High School for the Arts in Mount Makiling in Laguna. We also have scientific and technological significance. Technological because buildings, of course, are products also of technology. So they also are places where the newest technologies are exhibited. So, for example, this building was built in between the years of 1910 and 1911. The architect was William Parsons, and if you look at it, even though it looks like a very traditional building, it was built with very cutting edge materials back then. So this is part of a publication from 1911 that was produced by the Truss Concrete Steel Company of Detroit, Michigan, and they were one of the exponents in the use of reinforced concrete. And inside this building, when you go through the materials, you still see a lot of these new materials back then that are still intact. Like, for example, high rib came out in 1909. It was patented by the Truss Concrete Steel Company, or Trusscon, in 1909. And a year later, it was already being used in this and many other buildings in the Philippines. This is the Film Life building. Sadly, this building is currently being demolished, but you see also its use of like current technology for that period. If you see beyond the beautiful sculptural canopy, you see the horizontal sun baffles that it has. So even when you are in the interiors, what is very imposing is the exterior of those sun baffles, that composition. And here you have close-ups of those sun baffles. And actually, what is missing is scale, because if you put a person here in these photos, you'd see how big these baffles are. They're actually about 1.2 meters in depth, right? So these are very, very big. But the architect, Carlos Argüelles, was a master of scale and proportion, so that when you saw it from the street, it didn't actually look big because it was so well proportioned to the entire building. But if you look at catalogs of building materials from that time, you would see things like this. This is structural airfoil. So it is very similar to what you have in the Film Life building. And it was used a lot in buildings in the Western world, especially where there was a lot of wind hitting the buildings, right? But here the use is also to shade the interiors from the very, very harsh sunlight that comes in all year round. Another technologically significant space in the Film Life building is this one. It's the performance hall in the Film Life building. It's theater, uh, used to have one of the most perfect acoustics for classical concerts. So whenever classical music was recorded in Manila, whether it be a solo or chamber performance or even by the Philharmonic, it wasn't the cultural center of the Philippines that they would use for recordings. It was actually this one, simply because for classical music, this one had the best acoustics, and it won't come as a surprise because the designers of the acoustics for this theater were the same designers that were hired for the Sydney Opera House. Social significance is also very important. And you see here, social significance of a place is derived from a perceived meaning or symbolic, spiritual, or moral value in the place. So a group would have a very strong sense of attachment. And how would groups have attachments to places? They might have been public spaces, or they may still be public spaces. They may be places of meeting, or places of resort and public entertainment, places associated with recent significant events, commemorative places, or places with special meaning for particular communities. So let's look at specific examples of places that could have social significance. So we've been seeing theaters earlier, right? And most of those theaters from the Art Deco period all the way up to the 1960s were in the downtown district of Manila, particularly along this avenue called Avenida Rizal. Everybody just refers to it as Avenida. But you have the biggest theaters here, like the Ideal Theater is there, State Theater, Avenue Theater. They're all along this famous road. Why is it? It's because this used to be the center of the city back then. So a lot of people would actually come here after work or something like that, right? And they don't just watch movies in these theaters. We have to remember that these theaters also had stage performances. The older ones they called vaudeville, and then they progressed into other stage shows. So the most important actors and actresses had their debuts in these theaters, in one of these theaters, right? Also holding social significance could be the shopping areas. For example, this is a street in Manila. It's called Carriedo. And up to today, it is a mecca for shopping. So if you just take out all of these electrical lines and take out the not so good looking signages, you have an ensemble of really, really beautiful buildings constructed between the 1950s and the 1970s. And they have this typical architecture that overarch into the sidewalks, and you're actually walking under a building as you traverse the street, right? So you're actually safe from sun or rain. This is a characteristic of the architecture and urbanism that had happened in older commercial districts, and it's something that we don't see anymore in newer commercial districts, which is why these older districts also hold a lot of value, because they also illustrate to you beyond the social significance. They also illustrate the development of how architecture was being done in the Philippines and how urbanism progressed in the Philippines. Also having social significance is, for example, the Araneta Coliseum. It holds a huge technological significance because when it was built, it had the biggest dome in the world, right? But socially significant because of the many, many performances and sports activities that have happened here. This hosted the very famous Thrilla in Manila boxing match where Muhammad Ali was, and a lot of other a lot of other sporting events and concerts where everybody just went to, and a lot of people have an affinity to this structure because of all of those activities. Places like hotels also will hold social significance because of the many functions that they have hosted. This is a very important building that was constructed in 1976 and designed by the notable architect 𝗦𝗶𝗴𝗶𝗵𝗶. But it could also hold historical significance because if you remember some years back, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I think that was 15 years ago, there was a coup d'etat that happened here. Suddenly, we were glued to our screens seeing an army tank ramming into the very, very posh lobby of the Manila Peninsula Hotel. So that also is a very significant event. So you have a building that holds historical significance, social significance. Maybe also it's important because it represents a specific development in the architecture here in the Philippines. So maybe in summing up, we could say that shifts in style may reflect changes in political cultures and systems, patterns in economics, including trade, an important node in history, new construction technologies and methodologies, changes in social patterns, and so many more. Again, we go back to the law, right? Section 5. But this time, I'd like to direct you to the last part of this slide, right? The most bottom part. So it says that the property owner may petition the appropriate cultural agency to remove the presumption of important cultural property, which shall not be reasonably withheld. When that presumption is removed, then the owner can do anything to the property, anything from modifying it to eventually demolishing the property and redeveloping the site. So you can imagine all of these architectures that we've seen, maybe some of them are not yet declared by the pertinent cultural agency, and they are only presumed. So the reason why we're looking at the significance is to be able to say that, hey, look, wait a minute, maybe you could rethink your development strategy, right? Maybe demolition isn't the only solution. Maybe if there is significance in these works, then you can work with that significance and develop a better project in the end. So in closing, I'd just like to say that the architecture of the modern movement is as important as those from periods before it, because a lot of us would only see significance in like architectures of like the Spanish period, the churches, the old houses, or maybe like from the early American period, like the ones I showed you, the dormitory in the Philippine General Hospital. But more modern buildings also deserve this attention, and a lot of them have already acquired significance as they have aged. So with that, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Masiana also, and domo arigato gozaimasu.